I am Ben Hunter, live up in Heber City. And this story is about the miracle on Long Island in 1776. Throughout the Revolutionary War, George Washington showed great faith in Heavenly Father, and he experienced many miracles. One such miracle happened in August 1776. Not long after the Declaration of Independence was signed, George Washington and his troops fought the British, who were under the command of General Howe, in New York at the Battle of Long Island. The Americans lost the battle with 500 men killed or wounded and 1,100 taken as prisoners. Then General Howe forced Washington and his men to the very edge of Long Island. They were trapped with 20,000 British soldiers before them, and behind them lay the East River, which was 1 mile wide and 1 mile from New York. General Howe made a mistake when he waited for his brother to arrive with more soldiers before attacking again. During this wait, many Americans went to the Lord in prayer, seeking deliverance. Seeing that there was no way to defeat the British on Long Island, Washington came up with a daring military retreat. In answer to prayer, the mighty hand of God demonstrated his control over their disastrous condition. At 10 o'clock at night on August 29th, Washington began to evacuate his troops of 5,000 men. Washington assigned soldiers to stand at attention in a line where the British could see them, so they would think nothing was going on, while the rest of the men were being taken across the river by boat. After rowing back and forth all night long, there were still many soldiers left on the island. Washington still needed an additional 5 hours to finish getting his troops across the river. Just as it was getting light, a very thick fog came up the river and settled on both the British and American camps. At first, the rising fog caused a panic among the troops because they could not see their enemy, but that also meant that the British could not see them either. The sun rose in the sky, but the fog stayed. It was only after the last of Washington's soldiers had been safely ferried across the river did the miraculous fog lift. 2 hours later, the British swarmed into the empty trenches. Washington trusted in God, and God brought Washington's men to safety.
My youngest son just got stage fright. But his favorite story is President Washington, General George Washington crossing the Delaware. On Christmas night of 1776, General Washington was faced with a situation with the Army of having 1 week left of their enlistment that they had been given by their various states and by Congress. And he needed a victory to boost the morale of the Continental Army. And so with the inspiration he had received from the Lord, he realized that one of the opportunities he had was right there before him on Christmas. The city of Trenton was guarded by Haitian soldiers who had been hired by the British to help them in defeating the American cause. And during this time, the British had decided to spread their troops throughout New Jersey, stationing the Haitian soldiers in the city of Trenton. General Washington was on the other side of the Delaware River. And so on Christmas night, he realized that all during the day of Christmas that the Germans had a favorite tradition of drinking and partying and carrying on all throughout and late into the night on Christmas night. And he knew that the next morning they would be basically drunk and unable and unfit for military duty. So he decided to cross the Delaware River all throughout the night, dealing with the ice that was floating throughout the river and carrying his 2,400 troops across and being able to attack the Haitian soldiers the following morning. A Tory spy had gotten wind of what General Washington was going to do and had given a note to the commanding officer of the Haitian troops of the movement that George Washington was going to do with his troops. The Haitian general believed that it would be impossible for anyone to dare try and venture out into the storm that was there on that particular holiday. So he put the note into his pocket and never read it. The following morning, after General Washington had gotten his troops across the river, they then marched into the city of Trenton, and within 30 minutes had captured 1,000 Haitian soldiers and had captured the city. A week later, on January 3rd, 1777, the British decided they were going to try and capture General Washington, who had now lodged himself in the city of Trenton. But again, General Washington, under inspiration from the Lord, realized another military opportunity that he had, found out what was going on with the British. And so he kept his fires burning in the city of Trenton to give the impression that the American troops were still lodged there. And in the meantime, he goes around the back routes and attacks the city of Princeton, where the British troops had just left, defeated the soldiers who were left there in the city of Princeton, and captured both towns in 1 week. The morale of the American troops was greatly lifted, and most of his soldiers stayed enlisted.
Okay, my name is April Peterson, and I am more than honored to speak here today, to be able to speak on the subject of George Washington. George Washington is a man that I respect a lot for what he has done for this country and just for the man he was. So instead of speaking on a story, I decided to speak on his character. Because if you know his character, you know him even though you never met the man before. When I say character such as honor, honesty, respect, truth, righteous, charitable, and humble come to my mind. Those and other good important things to his character. He lived his life to have. So I'm going to speak why or what he did to have each one of these so important things to his character. First, honor. Throughout his life, he would only make his decisions if they were honorable. If something was not correct, he would not choose to do the incorrect thing. His whole life, from the time he knew right from wrong, he chose to respect and honor his God. That explains why he put his life on the line all the time, because he honored his God so much that he would rather die in honor than see others' God-given rights taken from him. The greatest honor one can have is for God and truth, and that indeed he had. Respect. He was a great man himself, and yet he respected others, showing that he lacked all false pride. Honesty. The following is a letter George Washington wrote. I hope I shall always possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain that what I consider the most valuable of all titles, the character of an honest man. That shows George Washington was striving to be and was indeed an honest man. Truth. He was just a man, and yet he stood so tall for truth. If it was truth, he lived for it. If it was a lie, he despised it. Whatever the lie may be. The reason that under George Washington and so many other good generals that the Revolutionary War was won is because truth was with them and truth prevailed. That explains why our country was founded on God and truth. It's because, like George Washington, the founding fathers were men of truth. Righteous, a man righteous indeed, but that quality is so simple to see with all the other qualities that I do not need to talk to on that one. It will come out in all the other character traits being explained here. Charitable. Yes, he truly was a man of charity. He would indeed go out of his way to give. When others would need help, they could rely on coming to his farmstead for help. Humble. Indeed, he was a man that everyone wanted to leave them, but yet had such a hard time accepting the fact that he was the right man for his new young country. He was complimented so much, but he never acted prideful. For example, he was sent a letter of such credit to himself, and yet his reply to those that credited him was so humble. I'm going to read something that George Washington wrote himself. By the miraculous care of Providence that protected me beyond all human exceptions, I had 4 bullets through my coat, and 2 horses sat under me, and yet escaped unhurt. George Washington's purpose on earth, I hope, shall never be forgotten. Did he finish his service to his country when he left the offices in which he served? No, I believe as long as people care, he can do anybody service if they follow his example forever. May people respect him, because he's the kind of man who will have blessings in heaven forever. To go off the point, I would like to say that Cleon Skalden is a man who is to be credited forever. He does not have the fame of a whole country, but he has done a great service for his country through his books. I believe that great statespeople shall come because of Cleon Skalden's books. So I would like to say that Cleon Skalden is a man of good character. Through his books, great knowledge can come to anyone who seeks truth, because his books are full of truth. I ask Cleon Skalden to accept this compliment. If anybody can come near to compare with the character of George Washington, it is truly great men like Cleon Skalden.
Today I would like to talk about George Washington and his young life. He did a lot of extraordinary things in his young life that most people don't know about. George Washington was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on a farm that would later be called Wakefield. His father's first wife had 4 children, and his father's second wife had 6 children. They lived in a house that was close to Potomac River and less than 50 miles from the frontier. They were constantly under attack from Indians, their city, and they often had to hide from the Indians because the frontier was where the Indians lived and they were trying to settle. Later in his life, he led a small party to Fort Le Boeuf. This is just before the French and Indian War, where its commander stated France's determination to possess the disputed area. Returning to Williamsburg, Washington delivered the defiant reply. He also wrote a report which told of how he spent a winter in the wilderness, and it also enhanced his reputation for being very resourceful. Dinwiddie then put Washington in command of an expedition to guard the intended British fort at the Forks of Ohio, at the present site of Vicksburg. On the way, he learned that the French had expelled the Virginia fort builders and were completing the works, which they named Fort Duchesne. He advanced to Great Meadows, Pennsylvania, about 15 miles southeast of the fort, where he erected Fort Necessity. On May 28, 1750, occurred one of the most disputed incidents of his career. Thinking that they were spies, he attacked a small French detachment that insisted that they were on a peaceful mission. Their leader, Joseph Colon de Villiers de Jumonville, was killed along with 9 of his men. According to many scholars, this is what started the French and Indian War. Washington thought it was he returned to Fort Necessity, which a large French force attacked on July 3rd. Fell after a day's fighting. Making the surrender, Washington signed a paper that imputed to him the blame for l'assassinat, murder of Jumonville. Not versed in French, Washington later explained that he had not understood the meaning of the incriminating word. By terms of surrender, he and his men were permitted to return disarmed to the Virginia settlements. The news of this defeat moved Britain to send to Virginia an expedition under General Edward Braddock, whom Washington joined as a voluntary aide for the camp. Without command of troops, Braddock's force reached a point on the Monongahela River about 7 miles southeast of Fort Duchesne, where on July 9, 1755, he suffered a surprise attack, a defeat that disordered in a very large retreat. Washington's role in this battle was to give morale to the troops, and because of his bravery, he was awarded the control of Virginia's troops. His new duties excluded him from the leadership in the major campaigns of the war, the operations of which were directed by British officials who assigned to Virginia the task of defending its inland frontiers. Although no important battles were fought there, Washington drilled his rough and often farmers instead of soldiers as recruits. Stationed them at frontier posts, he also settled disputes and struggled to maintain order and discipline. He labored to procure supplies and to get them transported, strove to have his men paid promptly and provided with shelter and medical care. He cared a lot for his men and tried to do everything for them that's possible. That is a lot of where his experience comes from as in the Army. His command training and the management of self-willed men familiarized him with the leaders of Virginia and schooled him in the regular politics of his society. Overall, I think he is a great man and that he deserves our recognition. And I think we need to learn more about him because he did so much for our country. If it weren't for him, we probably wouldn't have this college right here, because he was the one who fought the battle, and the British probably wouldn't have built this college. And that's my talk.
One of my favorite stories about George Washington is one of the times that he was found praying. A Quaker man who lived on the countryside near where the army was camped, he was out walking in the woods and he heard someone talking, so he quietly approached and he found George Washington praying on his knees. And he listened for a while, and then he went home. He went to his wife, and he and his wife, they were Quakers. They were against fighting, and I think they were against the revolution mainly. And he said to his wife that he knew that the Americans were in good hands. He didn't think that there was that army people were virtuous, but that just finding Washington praying like that completely changed his mind. And I think that is really great.
I'd just like to share a short story, one of my favorites about George Washington that I think most people probably haven't heard. During the Revolution, George Washington was one day riding by a group of soldiers who did not know him. They were busily engaged in raising some military works. It was a difficult task, and the corporal could often be heard saying, "Now you have it, all ready, pull." Washington quietly asked the corporal why he didn't turn to and help them. "Sir," angrily replied the corporal, "do you not realize that I am the corporal?" Washington politely raised his hat, saying, "I did not realize it. Beg pardon, Mr. Corporal." Then, dismounting, he himself fell to work and helped the men until the beam was raised. Before leaving, he turned to the corporal and, wiping the perspiration from his face, said, "If you ever need assistance like this again, call upon me, your commander-in-chief, and I will come." The confused corporal turned red, then white, as he realized that this was Washington himself to whom he had been so pompous.
I'd just like to read a little bit of a story for you. It's about when the war was almost finished and they had almost signed the treaty and everything. The soldiers and all the other leaders were getting nervous, and they didn't have clothes, they didn't have food. They were running out of everything. And they were all getting mad, and they decided to have a meeting. And George Washington wasn't supposed to know about it, but somehow he was informed. And I'll just read the letter. It said, "A country willing to redress your wrongs, cherish your worth, and reward your services. A country courting your return to private life with tears of gratitude and smiles of adoration, longing to divide with you that independency which your gallantry has given, and those riches your wounds have preserved. Is this the case, or is it rather a country that tramples upon your rights, disdains your cries, and insults your distresses? Have you not more than once suggested your wishes, and made known your wants to Congress? Can you consent to the only sufferers by this revolution, and retiring from the field, grow old in poverty, wretchedness, and contempt? Can you consent to wade through the vile mire of dependency and owe the miserable remnant of that life to charity which has hitherto been spent in honor? Tell Congress that the wound, often irritated and never healed, may at length become incurable." And Washington commanded everybody to not go to this meeting, and he announced another meeting to stop the fighting back, and he talked to them for a long time. He prepared a speech for them to tell them not to fight back and not to turn against the Congress, and most of the people didn't agree with him. And after a little while, he decided to read a little letter from Joseph Jones, a congressman from Virginia, and who expressed deep sympathy toward the army and pledged his help. And he thought if he read this, he could get them to maybe consent to wait a little longer. And for a little while, he fumbled and couldn't read it. So we tried to get out some glasses that nobody had seen him wear except close friends of his. And he couldn't get his glasses on. And he said, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." And I just think that he had given all that he had, everything, and without him, we could never be here. I'm so grateful that he was willing to give up everything.
Good morning. I'm Angela Bigelow from Pleasant Grove. And Before I begin, I'd just like to express my feelings a little bit on George Washington. I love George Washington. I know that he was sent to this earth for a purpose. I know that without him, it couldn't have worked the way that it did. I love him, and he was a man of such integrity, and I strive to follow that in my own life. Washington is also often seen as a great military hero, but on a more personal level, he was a very loving person. This is shown through several instances. He was very loving with his officers. Sometimes his officers would try to usurp his power. There are a few officers who did that, but he always forgave them very generally and very frankly. In his farewell for his officers, he said, well, someone wrote this about it. With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I most devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been as glorious and honorable. In closing, he said, I cannot come to each of you, but shall feel obliged if each of you will come and take me by the hand. General Knox, being nearest to him, turned to the commander-in-chief, who, suffused in tears, was incapable of utterance, but grasped his hand when they had embraced each other in silence. In the same affectionate manner, every officer in the room marched up to, kissed, and parted with his general-in-chief. Such a scene of sorrow and weeping I had not before witnessed, and hope I may never be called upon to witness again. Not a word was uttered to break the solemn silence, or to interrupt the tenderness of the scene. It's amazing that in such civility of being a general, that he genuinely loved all of his officers. He also loved his soldiers. In Valley Forge, he said that he would share in the hardship and partake of every inconvenience. He was not above his soldiers, but he was willing to go through it with them. He wrote, my feelings are every day wounded by the soldiers' dire situation. Also he wrote, although many seem to have little feeling for the naked and distressed soldier, I feel superabundantly for them, and from my soul pity those miseries which it is neither in my power to relieve or prevent. Lastly, he loved his country. He wrote, in giving his circular to the states, which was called Washington's Legacy, he said, to give my final blessing to that country in whose service I have spent the prime of my life, for whose sake I have consumed so many anxious days and watchful nights, and whose happiness, being extremely dear to me, will always constitute no inconsiderable part of my own. George Washington was an incredible man of character, and he had so much love in his heart for his soldiers, for his officers, and for his country. I hope that we can all become more like General Washington and have a deep and abiding sense of patriotism in our own hearts. I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
My name is Stephanie Hughes, and I'm from Orem. George Washington was an amazing man. Throughout his life, Washington proved this fact by his actions. His actions show us many things, including the fact that he was very kind and forgiving. This is one incident in which he shows his character through his actions. On November 30th, 1776, George Washington received a letter addressed to Joseph Reed, his adjutant general. The letter was from Charles Lee. However, Reed was absent at the time, and Washington was expecting word from General Lee. So he opened the letter and read it. Unfortunately, the letter said terrible things, bitterly criticizing Washington. It said that Washington was indecisive, which was worse than stupidity in war. Lee wrote that he had no intention of bringing assistance to Washington. He also thanked Reed for a note in which Reed apparently criticized General Washington. Washington simply forwarded the letter to Reed with an apology for having read it. He didn't say a word or even hint to Reed about his disloyalty, and somehow their friendship lasted and was strengthened through this incident. Later through the war, Reed gave Washington invaluable help. This incident shows George Washington's greatness of heart and his willingness to forgive and forget. Without such a great man as George Washington as general during the war and as the first president of the United States, it is doubtful our country could ever have survived.
George Washington was an incredible man. He, as has been mentioned, he dedicated his life to freedom and to liberty and to God. And because of this, I'd like to share with you a story that maybe some of you have heard, but it is absolutely incredible to me, and it shows to me that we are blessed. During the battle in the French and Indian War, where General Braddock was killed, George Washington was in the thick of the fighting, and he had bullets in his coat. He had horses shot from under him. He had bullets through his hat. But he miraculously was unharmed. 15 years later, as he was traveling with some of his officers through Indian territory, he met an Indian chief, and I cannot paraphrase the story, so I'm going to read it to you, what this chief has said. And he said, "I am a chief and the ruler over many tribes. My influence extends to the waters of the Great Lakes and to the far blue mountains. I have traveled along a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. It was on the day when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest that I first beheld this chief. I called to my young men and said, 'Mark, young, tall, and daring warrior. He is not of the redcoat tribe. He hath an Indian's wisdom, and his warriors fight as we do. Himself alone is exposed. Quick, let your aim be certain, and he dies.' Our rifles were leveled, rifles which but for him knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power mightier far than we shielded him from harm. He cannot die in battle. I am old and shall soon be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers in the land of the shades. But ere I go, there is something that bids me speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen. The Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He will become the chief of nations, and people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire." This is an incredible story. Because of this, because of his dedication, George Washington took no thought of his own life. During the Battle of Princeton, he himself was so surprised that his men fleeing from the British, that he himself galloped on his horse forward, leading his men forward into the thick of the fighting. He was less than several hundred yards from the British line when the British line raised their muskets and fired. An officer standing by said he could not bear to look and see his commander-in-chief fallen. But when the smoke cleared, there sat General Washington astride his great horse. This is just one of several instances. The same thing happened in New York. He was absolutely dedicated to freedom, and he took no thought of his own life. This is why during the Constitutional Convention, it was said that if General Washington doesn't come, it will not work. He was called the indispensable man of America, and I greatly believe it. His character has proven to me that if you are dedicated, nothing is impossible. And I just like to share these things with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
These young people that you have just heard have been studying the real George Washington for the past several months. They have brought their notebooks that they did in relationship to this. I hope that in a break that you will go look at these incredible notebooks. If anyone could be compared to General Washington, it would be General Moroni. And the scriptures are so powerful about that. They say if all men ever would be as full of the Spirit and as great as Christians, that the very powers of hell would shake. And this is what General Washington was. He participated in the three great events that secured liberty for us. The Revolutionary War, literally being protected by the hand of the Lord and led by him throughout the battles. We never should have won that war. We only did because of the hand of God, where he literally saved this nation and prepared it for what lies in futurity, his second coming. The second great event that he participated in, hesitantly at first, but as his spirit grew, he knew that we must have a firm and a strong constitution if we were going to preserve the liberties that he had fought those 7 long years to obtain, along with his men at great sacrifice. You need to read those stories. It's incredible. And so he attended the Constitutional Convention as one of the great supporters of this new form of government. And then thirdly, when he wanted to retire to Mount Vernon and go home, he was weary. They called him back into service because they knew that only as president, with him at the helm, could we get off to the start and secure these liberties on a firm foundation. Everything bears witness at this. And when he came to that office, I guess I didn't realize that for the first year as president, he suffered terrible illnesses, almost to the point of death, and kept going on. And then when he didn't want to do a second term, they said, stay another term and get us on our feet. And only then did he retire to his beloved home and to peace and tranquility. And even then, a year after he got home, just before his death, when we were threatened from abroad, they were asking him, if we need to fight, will you come back and be the commander-in-chief? And he said, yes, yes, all dedication. I bear you my witness that this man was raised up by the hand of the Lord to be at the very foundation of all that we hold dear. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.